All right, this is for SGD 212, and we're working through the design book. We are finally on contrast, the C in crap. All right. Contrast, as the book says, is one of the most effective ways to add visual interest to your page. A striking interest that makes a reader want to look at the page. Right. The important rule to remember is that for contrast to be effective, it must be strong. Don't be a wimp. Right. So there. Contrast is created when two elements are different. Duh, right? If two elements are sort of different, but not really, then you don't have contrast, you have conflict, right? If two items are not exactly the same, then make them different. Really different. All right? So you can create contrast in many ways, right? Large type, small type, graceful old style font with bold sans serif font, thin line with thick lines, etc. But don't be a wimp. You cannot contrast 12-point type with 14-point type. You cannot contrast a half-point rule with 1-point rule. You cannot contrast dark brown with black. Get serious. All right. Two newsletters below came across your desk. Which one would you pick up first? They both have the same basic layout. They're both nice and neat. They both have the same information on the page. There is really only one difference. The newsletter on the right has more contrast. And there's example 1, example 2. This one doesn't, kind of just sits there. This one pops, right? This one definitely is more appealing visually, right? All right. Contrast is crucial to the organization of information. A reader should always be able to glance at a document and instantly understand what's going on. Take a look at this, right? The information is all there, and if somebody really wants to read it, they will, but it certainly doesn't grab your attention. There are two alignments on the page, centered and flush left. The amount of space between the separate segments are too similar. Setup is inconsistent. Sometimes the dates are on the left, sometimes on the right. Remember, consistency creates repetition. The job titles blend in with the body text. Look at this one. It's redone, and it's shows much greater contrast, right? Notice that not only is the page more attractive when contrast is used, but the purpose and organization of the document are much clearer. Your resume is someone's first impression of you, so make it sharp. The easiest way to add interesting contrast is with typefaces, but don't forget about rules, drawing lines, color spacing between elements, textures, etc. If you use a hairline rule between columns, use a strong 2 or 4-point rule when you need another. Don't use half-point rule and 1-point rule on the same page. If you use a second color for accent, make sure the colors contrast. Dark brown or dark blue doesn't contrast effectively with black text. See these rules here, they're too close together in size. Here they've been differentiated to a much greater degree. And here they have a background color for the title, which really makes that pop. All right. If you use tall, narrow columns in your newsletter, have a few strong headlines to create a contrasting horizontal direction across the page. Combine contrast with repetition, as in the page numbers or headlines or bullets or rules or spatial arrangements, to make a strong unifying identity throughout an entire publication. So the example below is a typical flyer. The biggest problem is that lines of the text are too long and to read comfortably, and there's nothing to draw the reader's eye to the text. Where do you begin to improve this flyer, right? What do you do? Let's see what they did. All right. But don't be afraid to make some items small to create contrast with the larger items. Don't be afraid to allow blank space. Once you pull readers in with the focal point, they will read the smaller print if they are interested. If they're not interested, it won't matter how big you set it. Notice all the other principles come into play: proximity, alignment, and repetition. They work together to create a total effect. Rarely will you use just one principle to design any one page. Contrast is the most fun of the design principles and the most dramatic. A few simple changes can make the difference between an ordinary design and a powerful one. You see this? This rack card for a great book is a little flat. The next one improves on it, right? Changing the headline book title from upper to lowercase gave me room to make it bigger and bolder. Since the rack card is an advertisement for a book, let's show the book bigger. For repetition, I picked up the strong black that appears in the book. I put the photo of Cynthia on the other side of the card because this side was getting so busy. Contrast, of course, is rarely the only concept that needs to be emphasized, but you'll often find that if you add contrast, the other concepts seem to fall into place. Your elements of contrast, for instance, can sometimes be used as elements of repetition. Look at this rather boring flyer here, or ad ran in a local newspaper. And look at this, right? The ad below looks like a radical leap from the one on the opposite page. It is actually just a methodical application of the 4 basic principles. All right. Let go of center and alignment. I know it's hard to do. Find the most interesting, most important item on the page and emphasize it. In this case, the most interesting is the dog's face, and the most important is the name of the store. Keep the most important things together so a reader doesn't lose the focus. Group the information in logical groups. Use space to set items apart or connect them. Find elements you can repeat. And most important, add contrast. Here's something we saw in chapter 2. Look what they've done now, right? All right, so I hope you're starting to see how important contrast is to the design piece and how easy it is actually to add contrast. You just have to be conscious. Once you have the contrast, elements of it can be used for repetition. All I did was add a bit of dark color background. The page is much more dynamic and interesting to view. Summary of contrast. Contrast on a page draws our eyes to it. Our eyes like contrast. If you're putting 2 elements on the page that are not the same, such as 2 typefaces or 2 line widths, they cannot be similar. For contrast to be effective, the 2 elements must be very different. Contrast is kind of like matching wall paint when you need to spot paint. You can't sort of match the color. Either you match it exactly or you paint their entire wall. As my grandfather, an avid horseshoe player, always only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. The basic purpose. Contrast has 2 purposes, and they're inextricable from each other. One purpose is to create an interest on the page. If a page is interesting to look at, it is more likely to be read. The other is to aid in the organization of the information. A reader should be able to instantly understand the way the information is organized, the logical flow from one item to another. The contrasting element should never serve to confuse the reader or to create a focus that is not supposed to be a focus. Add contrast through your typeface choices, line thicknesses, colors, shapes, sizes, space, etc. It is easy to find ways to add contrast, and is probably the most fun and satisfying way to add visual interest. The important thing is to be strong. What to avoid? Don't be a wimp. If you're going to contrast, do it with strength. Avoid contrasting a sort of heavy line with a sort of heavier line. Avoid contrasting brown text with black headlines. Avoid using 2 or more typefaces that are similar. If the items are not exactly the same, make them different.